First, some news. The Vatican released an apostolic exhortation by Pope Francis this week. It's titled, Christ is Alive. The 33,000-word document was published on April 2nd. It was written in response to last October's Youth Synod. Francis maps out what he calls an open church that he feels would be more attractive to young people. More on what that means in our next segment. And a new shepherd's coming to the Archdiocese of Washington, as first reported by the Catholic news agency. Archbishop Wilton Gregory of Atlanta was named to succeed the embattled Cardinal Donald Wuerl, who stepped down in the wake of the Pennsylvania grand jury report and then the McCarrick scandal. Gregory, who is 71, will be the first African-American Archbishop of Washington. He served as president of the U.S. Bishops' Conference when the sex abuse crisis first broke back in the early 2000s. Here's what Gregory had to say in February of 2004, just after the release of the John Jay Criminal Report.
I can say with absolute assurance that the bishops now have in place the means of responding immediately to allegations, assisting victims, and removing offenders from ministry. The terrible history recorded here today is history.
Joining me now with in-depth analysis of the Gregory appointment and Francis's new apostolic exhortation is a priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father GERALD MURRAY, and editor-in-chief of the Catholic Thing, Robert Royal. Papal Posse, welcome back. Okay, well, let's jump right into it. Before we get to Christ is Alive, we've got to start with this big breaking story of the week, the appointment of Wilton Gregory as the next Archbishop of Washington. The announcement was made today. He accepted the appointment. Here's the presser.
I want to come to know you, to hear your stories, to listen to the emotions, experiences, and expectations that have shaped your precious Catholic faith, for better or for worse. I want to offer you hope. I will rebuild your trust.
Gentlemen, your initial thoughts.
Well, I think that's a breath of fresh air to just talk about gaining trust, because there's a great deal of upsetness, outright anger, I would say, and a lack of trust here in the Archdiocese of Washington because of the whole McCarrick story and the Wuerl sequel to that. I have to say in all candor, though, that this seems to me to be, I'm almost tempted to joke about this, that this is Cardinal Wuerl by other means. We don't, I don't really see this as that much changing a page, because Wilton Gregory, Archbishop Gregory, has been close to McCarrick initially, says he was deceived by him over all those years, has been close to Cardinal Wuerl. So I think there's going to be a great deal of continuity, and maybe also that's something that the Vatican wanted. But I think we can at least hope that he recognizes how profoundly disturbed the Archdiocese of Washington has been, and in fact the whole nation, over what's happened.
Father Murray, a source told me in Washington today, this is business as usual. That's how they're interpreting this particular appointment. Archbishop Gregory is referred to as a moderate in many areas, lauded for his handling of the abuse crisis. He is the father and one of the architects of the zero tolerance policy, but that was only extended toward priests, not bishops. Did they clean up the sex abuse crisis properly then? And how, your thoughts on this appointment?
No, obviously it wasn't cleaned up properly because it's still ongoing. I mean, we're still having all these revelations. I think for the Archbishop to gain the trust of the people here and then also in the whole country, he has to come and do a kind of cleanup duty and find out how did McCarrick thrive? How did it happen? What happened when Pope Benedict put these provisions on him? In other words, an accountability for what happened in the past so that it will identify, we're not going to do these things in the future. Now, I will say I'm very happy to have the first black Archbishop of Washington, because black Catholics are a very important part of the history of the Church in the United States, and Washington, Baltimore area, one of the centers of black Catholicism. So that's I'm very happy about. But, you know, the issue here right now is, do the people trust the hierarchy? And the polls show they don't, so they have to work hard to gain that trust.
I want to move on to talk about another big story, got very little attention. The Archbishop of Guam, this Archbishop Apuron, was convicted of multiple abuses, sexual abuses of minors. He had a canonical trial. He was found guilty, and this was recently affirmed. But they're allowing him to continue to be called an archbishop. He's not being laicized. What do you make of this?
I find this very troubling. The Archbishop there, Arroyo, has been found guilty. The trial was conducted by Cardinal Burke. There was full evidentiary presentation and multiple convictions, sexual abuse of minors. This man should no longer enjoy the Catholic priesthood. He should be punished by being removed. And I find it to be very inconsistent with what the Pope said last August. The Pope talked about zero tolerance after the Pennsylvania report came forward. This man is basically being given a retirement package. You can't present yourself as an archbishop, but otherwise you stay the way you were. You're just a retired man. This isn't good.
As we heard from Archbishop Gregory earlier, the history in this report is history. It's not history. It's still ongoing.
Still with us. And the problem is that the Holy See has got a real hot potato here that it doesn't really know how to deal with. I think this case, I think Father is absolutely right. This is an outrageous case, and it seems very clear to me what they ought to be doing. They've been pulling back a little bit on this notion of zero tolerance. They say, I was over for the summit on abuse, they say that there are certain countries, Islamic countries in particular, where to accuse an archbishop or a bishop of abuse of some kind is virtually a death sentence. Okay, that's a prudential judgment to make. But when we have a case like this, that is, to all appearances, even far worse than the McCarrick case, as far as we can tell in terms of at least the minors that were abused, the Holy See, unless the Holy See presents a kind of a unified policy about how these things are going to be dealt with, we're going to continue to have this doubt about whether it's really being dealt with or whether there's this fuzzy quality that certain people get off and others are given benefits. We don't have a rule of law that says you do X, Y happens.
Well, in this youth exhortation, it's mute on this issue of zero tolerance. Doesn't talk about it at all, which sounds like it's off the table. I've got to get to this. The Pope made headlines this week on the plane back from Morocco. He doubled down on his condemnation of the death penalty. Listen.
Oggi noi abbiamo tolto dal catechismo della Chiesa Cattolica la pena di morte. 300 anni fa bruciavano vivi gli eresi perché la Chiesa sia accresciuta nella coscienza morale, il rispetto della persona, no? E la libertà di culto cresce pure. Anche noi dobbiamo continuare a crescere.
Father Murray, has the Church evolved beyond her teaching on capital punishment?
This is an extremely serious problem, Raymond. The Pope does not have the power to change the teaching of the Church, which is the perennial constant teaching, that the death penalty is moral in some cases. The use of it has never been described as immoral. It's executing people like Adolf Hitler, if he had made it out of the bunker. That would not be a violation of Adolf Hitler's dignity. In fact, it would be an affirmation of the dignity of humanity that someone who murders 6 million Jews and tens of millions of others die because of the war he started, for him to be executed would have been a good thing. Everybody would have agreed. This is a very serious, the Church does not change its teaching on matters that have been taught consistently simply because it becomes unpopular in the modern age.
And part of this is an idea that the Church teaching was you give a person guilty of heinous crimes a time period that they can reevaluate what they did, maybe make peace with God and save their soul, which is more important than the body. I mean, in the mind of the Church.
Absolutely.
I want to move on. We've got so much to get to. I'd love you to take cracks at all this. Pope Francis also spoke again about the fear of migrants on the plane.
È vero che tanta gente di buona volontà, non solo cattolici, ma gente buona, di buona volontà, è un po' presa dalla paura, che è la predica usuale dei populismi. La paura. Si semina paura e poi si prendono delle decisioni, no? La paura è l'inizio delle dittature.
So, fear of migrants, fear of the other, is this the reason behind border enforcement, and is this the right way to look, the right frame to put around this issue? Robert Royal.
Well, as a reporter asked the Holy Father on that flight, the peoples of Europe, the various nationalities of Europe, are directly opposed to the kind of thing that he is proposing, that in fact they all feel threatened, not only physically and in sort of a normal security sense, but they feel by a loss of their national identities in Europe. I mean, we feel somewhat the same thing because of our border problems with Mexico, but it isn't as acute as it is, as it is in Europe. Look, I think that this is a place where he's proposing, he's confusing a kind of a moral principle that we do have to take care of the widow, the orphan, the stranger among us, with a political policy. The policy about how much immigration a country can accept is something that public officials are going to have to be able to determine. The current regimes in Italy, for example, say that they have 5 million poor people in Italy already, Italians that are poor people. And the Minister of the Interior, Salvini, for example, often says, well, what am I going to do? Am I going to admit another 1 million or 2 million or 5 million people?
Or take care of my own.
I have to take care of my own first. So there are multiple considerations here, and I don't really think it's a good thing for the Holy Father to confuse what is a gospel principle, taking care of the stranger among us, with some tough choices that have to be made in the policy realm.
Cardinal Robert Serra, I know you're reading his book. He is often mentioned as a possible candidate for the papacy. He made headlines this week decrying the use of the Bible to justify mass migration in a French interview. He said this: "It is better to help people flourish in their culture than to encourage them to come to Europe in full decadence. It is a false exegesis to use the Word of God to promote migration." Is Cardinal Serra correct here? Father Murray, very quickly.
Cardinal Serra is on the target here. The countries in Europe, the United States, and others, we should encourage countries in the third world to develop structures for economic development and political freedom so people don't feel the necessity to risk their lives to come to a place where they can earn their living. He also talks about the principle that people deserve a homeland and a culture, and it shouldn't be deprived of them. How often we see that in the case, particularly the third world, dictators loot the money, impoverish the people, and then, you know, do nothing when people flee because it guarantees their power continues.
Robert Arroyo.
You know, one of the interesting things that came up during the Synod on Youth, and I was over there in Rome for that Synod, is, again, we tend to think of the immigration problem as, you know, the first world being invaded by poor people from elsewhere. One of the points that came up among other bishops is, in these poorer countries, what happens when your young people, the most dynamic dimension of your society, leave and go elsewhere? What about the future of those countries? And so I think the Holy Father actually mentioned this on the plane also, that the developed countries can perhaps aid development in these developing countries. That's another part of this question that really has to be addressed, because otherwise we're going to have utter disasters in the developing world, even worse than the ones we see right now.
I got to move on. Before we get to the exhortation, very quickly, norms were changed this week at the Vatican City-State. The Pope did this. And he made a significant change. It's an expansion of the definition of vulnerable adult. The new wording defines a vulnerable adult as anyone in an infirm state of physical or mental deficiency or deprivation of personal freedom that, in fact, even occasionally limits their capacity to intend or to want or in any way to resist an offense. And here he's talking about sexual abuse. That's a pretty broad definition. Is this an improvement, Father Murray?
I think it is, because we have to recognize precisely the Macara case brought forward. When you have bishops using their seminarians for immoral purposes, holding the threat of throwing them out of the seminary if they don't agree, this is a violation precisely of their freedom as an individual, and also their relationship, strange relationship with the hierarchy. They want to obey their bishop, but the bishop has to do immoral things. So I think it's a good...
yeah, but should this be applied to the wider church? This is just the Vatican City-State. Should it be applied to everybody so vulnerable adults are protected?
This is a good first step, and we can hope that it will be developed further.
Yeah. Sure. Okay, I want to move on. Let's go to this exhortation. It's called Christ is Alive. It was issued on April 2nd. Beginning with the Pope's take on the meaning of change, he writes, "The Church should not be excessively caught up in herself, but instead and above all, reflect Jesus Christ. This means humbly acknowledging that some things concretely need to change. And if that is to happen, she needs to appreciate the vision, but also the criticisms of young people." So, Father, is this saying the Church needs to follow the direction of the youth of the day?
It can give that impression. Certainly, young people who are fed up with the clerical toleration of sexual abuse, they should be listened to. You know, young people like the Latin Mass and find obstacles, they can't get it in their diocese, they should be listened to. You know, young people who go to a Catholic school want to learn about Christ instead of getting sociology. They should be listened to. But, you know, when dealing with young people, the first category, I think, has to be, the Pope said it in paragraph 150, friendship with Christ. We don't approach Christ with a critical attitude. We tell people, look, this is the Son of God, listen to him, learn from him, then we go forth and we try to figure out how do we apply it today.
The document also says when you're forming young people, when you're reaching out to them, don't excessively focus on doctrine. Is that the problem?
Yeah, I've said this before on this show, but the Holy Father seems to have this idea that there's an overly rigid, moralistic, abstract approach to young people.
Yeah, like a 1945 idea of the faith, you know, somebody
I think
wagging their finger.
I think it must correspond to something in his past experience, but my guess, I wrote a column about this just today at the Catholic thing, my guess is that the kind of thing that he's proposing, which is a more open, you know, pastoral reception of young people, has actually been the approach that we've had in places like the United States of America above all, but I think also in Europe to a large degree, and it only works to a certain extent. Now, he warns in the document that while we do want to get input from young people, we also don't want to just be part of whatever happens to be going along in the country. I'll tell you, this is one example of something that came up during the synod that I think does reflect, sadly, the circumstances in the world these days. Some of the young people at one of the language groups said, look, no one is going to read a long document. And this is a very long, complicated document that he's written. What they're going to need to do at the end is to put together online interactive little bits of, you know, paragraph at a time that you can go through. Now, I mean, we can laugh at that, and it isn't the end point that we want to arrive at, but probably we do need something like that because, unfortunately, the young people that we're dealing with are not readers and they're not prepared for too much.
He also talks in this document, Father Murray, a little further on about being inclusive in youth ministry. The Synod called, this is a quote, the Synod called for the development of a youth ministry capable of being inclusive, with room for all kinds of young people, to show that we are a church with open doors, nor does one have to accept fully all the teachings of the church to take part in certain activities for young people. And Francis recommends including atheists and non-Catholics in youth groups. Good idea?
Yes and no. I mean, certainly in my parish experience, you do have kids who are very weak in their faith and questioning, and you don't want to turn them away. You want them to come. But whenever I hear the word inclusivity, I immediately think, oh, this is what the homosexual agenda people use to say we can't exclude that point of view. Well, we're not going to turn our Catholic youth groups into promoting homosexuality. We shouldn't think that we're doing something wrong when teaching the teaching of the Church on this matter. And we should never give young people the false impression that the Catholic Church is somehow an exclusive group by virtue of teaching the truth. The truth will set us free. That's what we have to focus on. Now, everybody is welcome to come into that class, certainly.
Two quick things I have to get on, and this came up. My email box exploded when the Pope was in Morocco last weekend. He talked about proselytism and how you cannot proselytize. Don't work for converts. You are called to live side by side with people as brothers. Your reaction?
Well, the Vatican later tried to paper this over a little bit by citing John Paul II and also Benedict XVI, who said something similar. And, you know, strictly speaking, proselytism means sort of exerting pressure on people. And, of course, we don't want to do that. But, look, it's an odd thing to do, to go to a Christian community, a tiny and troubled Christian community in a place like Morocco, which is overwhelmingly Islamic, and warning them about something that has got to be the most distant thing from their mind. I mean, if he wanted to say, look, you shouldn't be in conflict constantly with your neighbors. You should try to live in peace. You know, we want to all help one another insofar as we're able to do this. I think that is a good message to send. To back Christians off from being outgoing and discussing their faith with other people, that just seems to me to be, first of all, not exactly the best message in the modern world, but particularly in a Muslim country, it just strikes me as a little bit inappropriate.
Yeah, I have to share this other bite with you. Again, this made headlines. It's kind of related. And the Pope at the Wednesday audience talked about why he went out to meet with the Muslim community in Morocco. And he underscored this point again, that God wills a diversity of religions in the world. He says this, but some may wonder, why does the Pope go to visit the Muslims and not only the Catholics? Because there are so many religions, and why are there so many religions? With the Muslims, we are descendants of the same father, Abraham. Why does God allow so many religions to exist? God wanted to allow this. The scholastic theologians referred to it as the permissive will of God. He willed to permit this reality. There are many religions, some are born of culture, but they always look to heaven, they look to God. Your reaction to the idea that God willed this and that we're all sons of Abraham?
Okay, the church teaches clearly God has willed Judaism as the chosen people, and then Christ, the Savior of Jew and Gentile, founded the Christian church, which is the fulfillment of the hope of Israel. Those are the only religions willed by God. Everything else is a human creation. We believe that. We do not believe that other people who are leaders of religions did that under divine inspiration to create rival interpretations of the meaning of salvation. The permissive will of God means God lets human beings make free choices on their own that God would not have otherwise chosen for himself to do. So this is an area that this caused a lot of controversy when the Pope said it originally, when he signed that agreement in Abu Dhabi.
Right.
I think he should basically issue a formal correction of this and say, look, there is only one church established by God, that is the Catholic Church, and that Judaism was the chosen people brought into the world in order that Christ might come and save Jew and Gentile. Those are the only religions revealed by God. That's what we teach.
Now, I know you've been getting a lot of, Robert Royal, a lot of questions about this. I've been reading your coverage in the Catholic thing. This kind of statement does open up to a lot of misunderstanding. Put the Pope up to.
Because look, the average person just hears that the Pope says other religions
are equal, are on the same plane, or
if
equal.
you actually look at that document, this is a signed document, an agreement with the King of Abu Dhabi and then the Vatican. What it says is that God willed a plurality of religions as he did a variety of races, nations, sexes, etc. So this puts what is a spiritual decision on the same plane with what is
races,
a natural, it's a natural thing that has occurred in the world. Like with the proselytism question, I could have written this sentence, but no one at the Vatican asked me to do it. I think again, what he wanted to say is that, of course, as Catholics, we believe that God has revealed to us how he wants us to live and who he is, etc. But as Catholics, part of what we believe God intends for us is to live as much as we can in peace and in cooperation with others who are willing to cooperate with us. That, I think, would have been the proper thing to do. Instead, what we have is a statement that has kind of theological and philosophical repercussions that just never end. And maybe Father is right. We need a formal, probably in writing correction so that we don't leave this mistaken impression with people around the world.
Well, we will await the correction. We'll leave it there. Posse, thank you for being here. Father Murray, Robert Royal. As always, you can catch the insightful commentary of the entire Posse at thecatholicthing.org.